Hey, what's going on, everybody? Hey, what's going on, everybody? Today, we're going to be taking a look at setting up a UniFi cloud controller. Now, if you're not sure what a cloud controller is, it's basically just a UniFi controller, but hosted by UniFi themselves and not actually on your local network. So typically, you would have something like a router and a switch with your access points hanging off of that, and then your controller hosted somewhere on a device local. But in this case, if we use a UniFi cloud controller, we just get rid of this physical box on our network, and instead we just rely on UniFi to host us basically a virtual server somewhere in the cloud that is running the controller software for us. Now, if this sounds really awesome, it's because it is, but it has one major downside for most everybody who wants to use it, and that is the fact that it costs $30 a month to run. And I know that there are some actual virtual server providers that can give you an entire virtual server for about that much a month. So this is definitely not for everybody, but who would benefit a lot from this is actually something like a managed service provider or somebody who is managing a lot of different UniFi sites. So instead of having to keep up with your own publicly available UniFi controller to manage dozens of different client sites or different branch offices or whatever, instead of having to keep up with the patching, the security, the updates, and everything for this device, instead you pay $30 a month and you let UniFi do it for you. Now, using a cloud controller comes with a couple of little nuances when you compare it to a regular on-premise controller. So usually when you set it up for the first time with an on-premise controller, you install it to your server, which is, again, connected to a switch, which is connected to your access points, and then you just browse to the IP of that device. So say something like 192.168.2.90, and then usually access it on port 8443. Instead of doing this, you are going to go to unifi.ui.com and then launch your network application from here. And some of you might be noticing, usually your devices just talk back to your controller if they're on the same network automatically, or if you're doing something like layer 3 adoption, you usually have to SSH into your devices and set the inform address to go to here, and you can also do that through DNS and DHCP. But if you notice, a cloud controller hosted by UniFi is not going to be on the local network at all. So you're going to have to find some way to tell your access points or switches or gateways or whatever else to communicate with this cloud server instead. So without rambling on too much with the theory stuff, let's go ahead and get into setting this up. So the first thing we're going to do is actually create our cloud controller instance. Now, I just get to this by Googling UniFi Cloud Controller, and this first link here for UniFi Cloud Gateways is actually not going to be what we want because that's for Dream Machines and whatnot. The second one, though, is for official UniFi hosting, and this is what we're going to want to go to. And you can see it comes from $29 a month, so basically $30 a month, and you can manage, it says, up to 1,000 UniFi network devices, and you can optionally pair it with a UXG gateway series, yada yada. Anyways, we're going to go ahead and start the trial for this, and you're going to want to log in with your UniFi cloud account. And if you don't have one, you can create one. That's what we're going to do here. I'm just going to say my username is toasty-answers, email toasty@toastyanswers.com, and I'll go ahead and create a somewhat secure password, agree to the privacy policy and terms of service, and I am not going to sign up for periodic newsletters. I'm just going to go ahead and hit create account. And now it sends me an email to basically register my account. So all I got to do is log in to my email account and click on the verify my email address, which I'm not showing on the screen. But if you've signed up for any accounts basically in the last 5 years, you get that verify your email message, you hit the button, and then you can sign into your account. So I just did that. I'm going to hit sign in, and I can either sign in with my email or username. So I'm just going to log in with toasty-answers, put in the password I just made, and sign in. and it says I need to verify my email address, which I just did. So why did it not take? And it looks like it was just because I was already signed in with a different account. So let's try this again, and it should go right through. All I had to do was just hit my verify email button again, and we are now in. Now, the first thing it wants us to do, obviously, set up a payment method. I know it said free trial, but this is one of those, free trials as long as we can charge you after it is finished. So we're going to add a payment method. And for obvious reasons, I'm not going to show you any of this, but all I did was entered my payment information so that it can have a card to charge as soon as I forget to cancel my free trial, which, trust me, I'm not going to forget. So after putting that in, we're dropped here to the UniFi Site Manager. Now we've got the 3 different areas we can go to. Cloud Gateway is for if we had a Dream Machine. We don't. Cloud Key, if we had a Cloud Key. What we want to go to is Official Hosting. And then here at the bottom, click to get started. Click here to set up the official UniFi hosting. So we're going to click that. We have the payment method that I just put in, and we're going to give it a name. And I'm just going to call it Toasties Cloud Controller, and select that I agree to the subscription terms and start the trial. Now, one thing that you might notice, which is a little weird, when we looked at the cloud hosting original page, it said that we can manage up to 1,000 devices at $29 a month, basically. It did not specify that that was a maximum and that you had to upgrade to $100 a month to manage that many, but you do. So for $29 a month, you can manage, it says, up to 100 devices. Now, I do know I have seen before that has said 500, so I'm not sure why it's 400 less than it used to be. But anyways, that's probably something to investigate later. So let's go ahead and click Start Trial. And that creates us our own little official hosting VM, if you will. So let's click on Toasties Cloud Controller. And this will bring us into our actual network instance. Now, this is going to look pretty much identical to any on-premise controller that you're going to deploy. The only difference is that this is hosted in the cloud. And there is one extra thing that you will see with this cloud-hosted controller that you don't see on an on-site one, and that is this copy inform URL link, as well as the adoption instructions. So adopting these APs is obviously a little bit different because this is hosted in the cloud. It can't discover the controller on its own on the local network. So if you go to adoption instructions, this will lay out pretty much exactly how to add devices to this cloud controller. And you can see they're pretty much the same 3 methods that I've gone over in videos past, and that is you can either SSH to the device and use the set inform command to manually point it to the cloud controller, or you can set DHCP option 43 or a DNS entry to resolve the UniFi DNS hostname to this cloud controller address. So while those 3 methods are the same, what you put in to actually do that is different. So when we do these 3 methods, we're going to have to use this inform URL, which if we just click copy inform URL, that puts it into our clipboard. If we go into something like Notepad or whatever else, we can paste that. And here is your inform URL for your cloud instance. So it's this long string of almost random numbers and letters, .unifihosting.ui.com. And then obviously you've got your 8080/inform, and it's over HTTP. So this is what we're going to want to use to get started. Now, what I have in our little test network here to get everything going is just a switch, an old UniFi access point, and of course my Edge Router X, which connects to the internet out here. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is actually reset this access point because I'm not entirely sure if it has another configuration already on it. But just in case that is what's going on, we're going to go ahead and reset it to factory, which is done simply by holding down this little reset button on the back here until the LED light comes on and then goes off, at which point we can release it and it'll reboot with factory default settings. And from here, we get to decide which of those 3 options we want to use to actually get this adopted. And that is 1, SSH to it and manually set that inform address. 2, put in a DHCP option 43. Or 3, put in a DNS entry. Now, which one of these you go with, I've kind of talked about this in the past, but whichever one you want to go with, it really depends on how your network is set up, what kind of network you're going into, and how complex the setup is going to be. So SSHing and manually setting the inform for each one is not a bad way to do it if you're only doing like a handful of access points. Like, it's not too bad to find the IP address and manually go into each one and set the inform. But if you're doing a lot more, then you might want to think about doing DHCP or DNS. Now, DHCP, at least for me, has been a little bit hit or miss. It does work if you have a device that kind of makes it easy to actually set this option. So if you have something like an Edge Router X or something that has DHCP option 43 built in the form of basically a UniFi controller field, and that'll automatically push it out to devices. But if you have something else like, I don't know, a Sonic Wall or FortiGate or just something different that really wasn't intended to do something like that, then you're going to have a little bit of a hard time getting that push with DHCP. Even Windows Server can be a little bit of a bear to get that working with, because you have to convert the IP address to like hex or something similar. It's not straightforward. So usually if you're doing a ton of these, you want to use DNS. And of course, if you're going to use DNS, you need to have your own local DNS server. So something like a Windows Server with DNS, or an Edge Router X with DNS proxy going on, something like that, where you can actually edit DNS-A records. Because what happens is when a UniFi AP comes online, it automatically goes out and tries to resolve the UniFi hostname, and this is what it will use as its controller if it's resolvable. So if you have a DNS-A record set for UniFi, then it'll grab a hold of that and know where to go for the controller. Now, one important thing that you want to pay attention to is your DNS suffix. So obviously, if you have a DNS server, it's probably sitting out here on your network resolving DNS entries for a certain domain. So something like mydomain.com, and I apologize that got super weird looking. Let's go ahead and just delete this DNS server. So your DNS server is probably resolving stuff for whatever.mydomain.com. So what you're going to want is to have it looking for unifi.mydomain.com. That's going to be the host name of your UniFi controller. So in order to do this, to make sure that it looks in the domain mydomain.com, you have to fill out what's called the DNS suffix for this device. And typically that is pushed with DHCP. So if you're not using option 43 to just push the controller itself, what you can do with DHCP is in the domain field is put mydomain.com as the DNS suffix. And when your access point gets its IP address via DHCP, it knows to append mydomain.com onto that UniFi lookup. And that is what makes the DNS lookup actually work. So let's go ahead and forget everything that we just wrote down here and get into the actual configuration. Now, first, I'm just going to manually set the inform address, because that's probably what most people are going to do, especially for pretty small deployments. So the first thing that we need to do is obviously figure out what IP our access point received. And this is going to differ between whatever you are actually using as your DHCP server. For me, I'm using a Windows server running DHCP. Your network is most likely different, so wherever you can go to look at your DHCP leases to see what new devices have grabbed what IPs, go there, figure out which one your access point grabbed. Now, going through this list here, I don't see anything that says UniFi or anything that would really identify it. So what I'm going to have to do is basically just test each of these addresses that don't really have any sort of name or description tied to them. And I can do this by MAC address if I want to plug these in to like Wireshark's OUI lookup tool and just see which one's UniFi. But pretty much if I just pull up PuTTY and try to get to these addresses that don't have a description, one of them should let me in with the default UBNT, and I'll know that that is an access point. So I'm just going to start with 114, try and open that, nothing, moving on. And I tried all of those and none of them came back with a login prompt. So what I had to do was actually get my UniFi mobile app out, open that up, and I immediately saw that 10.88.13.121 was pending adoption. So there's multiple ways to find out the IP of an access point you just plugged in. The UniFi app probably is the most simple, but usually I have some luck with just hitting up these empty ones. But it ended up already having a host name that I had given it before, so I completely just glossed over it because it didn't say anything like UniFi on it. So now that we have our IP address, we can SSH into that. So 10.88.13.121. Go ahead and SSH to that, accept it, log in as UBNT, and now we can set our inform address. And to do that, we just go back to our cloud controller, do this copy inform URL, open PuTTY back up, and do set-inform space, and then paste in that whole line. So everything you need is right there. As soon as you paste it in, you can just hit enter, and then that sends a request to our cloud controller for adoption. And if we go to our cloud controller and then to UniFi devices, we can see that our access point is in here pending adoption. So if you have multiple APs or a switch or whatever else in your network that you want to tie to this cloud controller, you can SSH into all of them and do that set inform and paste in the cloud controller's URL. Now I'm going to just go ahead and I'm going to revert this to factory default by doing a set default command. And this is just going to wipe out basically that config I just did and reset this to factory. So we should lose connection and it should drop out of waiting for adoption on our cloud controller. And there it goes, we lost connection. So the reason I'm doing this is we're going to try and set it up with DNS, which I think is the second most, I say popular option, but probably easiest option to do if you don't want to SSH into all your devices. So let's go ahead and exit out of that, see if we refresh the cloud console, if that goes away. And it looks like it did. So let's go ahead and go over to our DHCP server again. And we're going to hit up the scope options area. And what we can see here is the DNS domain name. This is basically the DNS suffix. We have a value of lan.vms.systems, which matches up to a DNS zone, which is hosted on our DNS server. So going back to our whiteboard for just a second, there's a few things that have to be in place for this DNS resolution to work. So we've got our UniFi AP connected to a switch, and we already know that we have a server which is running DHCP and DNS. So what has to happen for this DNS to work properly is when your access point goes to request an IP address, it's got to be able to get to the DHCP server, and then the DHCP server has to assign this device, for one, its IP address, but then it also has to have the actual DNS server address configured as an option, so it knows to use your internal DNS server for name resolution. If you leave this something, I don't want to say default, but typically what people use is like 8.8.8.8 for Google's public DNS or whatever your ISP has provided you. If you're using a public DNS, then you're not going to be able to resolve this UniFi hostname at all. So you need to get the IP that the AP is going to use, as well as the DNS server, which points to your actual DNS server. And then in addition to that, you need to have your domain specified so that your AP knows which domain it is a part of, so it knows which zone to look for this UniFi record in. Now, if that is as clear as mud, I'm sorry, but that's how that works, and it will save you a ton of time in larger deployments. My kind of recommendation is just to do the set inform using SSH manually, unless you are doing something crazy with, I don't know, probably more than 10 or 20 access points. So for a home environment, doing that is just fine. So let's go and look at DHCP again. Actually, never mind. We just looked at that. We have the correct domain name. So now we just need to go into DNS for that zone and see if we have an entry named UniFi. And I do, but that's pointed to the wrong IP address. So we're going to update this A record. Actually, we're just going to completely delete this A record, and we're going to replace it with a CNAME. And what a CNAME record does is it basically just takes, hey, you wanted to get to this domain, like unifi.mydomain.com. Well, that's located at a completely different domain. So for that to make sense, we're going to say UniFi.LAN.VMS.systems is going to translate into our domain name that we got for the cloud controller. So if we go back to our cloud controller, back to the dashboard, copy that inform URL again, then this is what we get. So what we're saying by putting in the CNAME record is that UniFi.LAN.VMS.systems, which is our local domain, is going to translate into this URL. So what we want to do is actually delete this 8080 /inform off the end, and we're also going to want to delete the HTTP out of there, leaving only this core URL. And this is what we're going to copy and paste into our DNS server as the CNAME record. So here we are back on the server. UniFi is going to translate into this, and we're just going to hit OK. So now whenever our access point gets its information via DHCP, it's going to reach out to the DNS server. It's going to look for this UniFi host. It's going to see that this CNAME record is actually what it needs to go to. So it's going to basically redirect, even though it's not a true redirect, but it's going to send it along to this URL instead of our local domain. So in order for that to happen, because I've already rebooted the AP to put it into factory defaults, we're going to restart the session and reboot it again. So logging in with SSH, I'm just going to type in reboot. We lose connection because we are restarting that access point. And while that happens, we're going to go back to our cloud controller instance and see if we can't find something that pops up. So let's go to our devices tab and basically just wait for it to get that info from DHCP and find our cloud controller. And nothing seems to be appearing. So what's going on here? Why is our access point not finding this? Well, let's go back and check DHCP one more time. So let's look through these options that we put into the scope that our access point is getting. We got the default gateway, we got the DNS servers, that is correct. We got the DNS domain name, that is also correct. But what's this? Option 43, vendor specific info. That is the second way that we can add this, which is via DHCP. So what I already had was a DHCP option to point to my internal UniFi controller, basically. So this is what I was talking about with how to point it to a controller with DHCP. It is not straightforward because this hex code is basically the IP address. You have to convert the IP address of your controller to hexadecimal and put it in this option 43, at least for a Windows server. So what we're going to do is we're going to delete this entry because that's going to take precedence over our DNS lookup. If there's an option 43 that tells the device where the controller is, it's going to trust that over trying to resolve UniFi. So with that record gone, let's go back to our access point, log in UBNT, and do another reboot. And now this time, when it grabs its address with DHCP, it shouldn't grab that option 43, and fingers crossed it shows up in our cloud controller. And there we go, it shows up. So if I wouldn't have already had that option 43 set in my DHCP server, then this would have shown up correctly the first time. But now we can just click to adopt this access point to our cloud controller instance, and that is basically how you use this. So if you're used to managing a on-site UniFi controller, this is the exact same thing. However, you just have to treat any device additions as layer 3 adoption. So you have to use either the manual set inform, the DHCP option 43, or the DNS record. But other than that, everything else is still the same. You've still got your device list. You've still got your settings for your wireless network, your wired networks, and all of that. And the only downside is that you're paying monthly for this service. So this has gone on probably long enough. I'm going to go ahead and end it here. I'm going to do another video on this cloud controller, basically where we migrate on-premise controllers to the cloud. Because if you are working in a business environment and this is something that is interesting to you and you're going to pay the $30 a month to have this, then you're probably going to migrate existing clients that have an on-site controller into this cloud instance to at least get your money's worth. But if you were curious just how to get it off the ground and running, This is how you do that, and hopefully you learned something. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. And as always, happy networking.